Good evening. I'd like to call to order the June 20th, 2018 Planning Board meeting, and we have one thing on their agenda, and I'll pass it off to our town planner, Tom Bott.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Bott. I'm the town planner here in Falmouth, Mass. And I have the pleasure of introducing Sharon Rooney, who is the chief planner for the Cape Cod Commission, and then getting out of the way. Corey Pacheco, Falmouth's assistant town planner, and I have been working with the commission and Union Studios on this project, which we believe will help to advance the goals and ideals of the Davis Straits Reset plan. Also a plan we did in conjunction with Cape Cod Commission. A plan to redevelop this area, which will create mixed-use developments and housing in an area where it's currently a sea of asphalt that supports a sticks and mortar retail use that most of us believe is going away. So we have an opportunity to have another tool to bring to people to help to visualize how that might be. And with that, I'll happily turn it over to Sharon to introduce the team. For those of you who may not have met Heather Harper, she is the Chief of Staff of the Cape Cod Commission.
Good afternoon. First, I want to do some thank yous first. First to the town manager and board of selectmen who supported a grant application to the Department of Energy and Environmental Affairs to support this program, as well as the great welcome and support we've had from Tom and Corey to pull this together. I want to kind of take us out maybe 30,000 feet to think about really why we're here and why the Department of Energy and Environment thinks talking about form-based code in Falmouth, East Hammond, Orleans is an environmental initiative. And so the name of the project as we presented it to the state was Community Resiliency by Design. And that really was a result of our reflecting on some of the major land use patterns in our region and in these communities that have resulted in a 10-year period from 2001 to 2011, a loss of over 2,300 acres of ground cover and forest cover. And that's after we had, the major initiatives relative to the land bank and improvements in wetland protections bylaws and all of the environmental regulations that we saw really come to the fore in the later part of the last century. And really is demonstrative of the effect of the expansion of single-family homes. And so those cuts of forest cover have not been the result of very large projects. They've been one really small slice at a time across our environment. So that was sort of the driver behind how do we think about planning for community needs at the same time as we think about environmental resiliency. So as we think about environmental resiliency, we're also thinking about the resiliency of our community. And we've stolen, social scientist folks have stolen from the natural sciences and by using the term resiliency. And if you think of a healthy biological system, it's generally rife with all kinds of different species and habitats. In our housing market on Cape Cod, we really are a housing monoculture. We're dominated by single-family homes. We have over 80% of our housing stock in single-family homes. With just much less than 20% in a variety of sources, well below the Commonwealth and well below the nation, which hover between 50 and 60% single-family homes. So just to put that in perspective, we have a lot more single-family homes by proportion than other areas of the state and the nation. And the same goes for tenure, who's living here, ownership or renters. We have about over 80% of our housing supply is provided in ownership units and less than 20% in rental units. So that gateway to the housing market really simply isn't available to the immigrants or labor force, those coming to our region who want to contribute to the region's economy. Nationally, that is more like 70-30. So in just those two criteria, we know that we're sort of off kilter in terms of what you see in a healthy, normal economy. Of course, that's perpetuated and exacerbated by the seasonality of our economy, where we support over 50% of the Commonwealth seasonal housing units. Now think about that in terms of what has happened in our housing supply over the last 35, 40 years. In 1971, the single-family home size was under 1,500 square feet on Cape Cod. Today, it's 2,400 square feet. That's greater than the Massachusetts average and greater than national average in single-family home size. So we've seen all of these factors happening at the same time. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You're the planning board, you think about this stuff all the time. But I did want to put this in perspective. And all of these factors have resulted in a housing demand and a circumstance. We have over 26,000 housing units on Cape Cod that are demanded by the market. So we have a shortfall in the housing supply that we have currently. We project that that housing demand is going to continue and grow over the next 10 years. Our average age continues to rise, and we have this band of millennials who is a cohort in age not likely to be attracted to Cape Cod based on those economic factors I've already mentioned, but in the market outside of Cape Cod are going to increase household heads by over 45%. So big drivers in the economy, drivers in the market. Tom mentioned one of them, of course, is the changing nature of retail, which is going to drive the way our land uses are used. So we're really, this exercise today is going to be a little bit of looking at pretty pictures, but it really is a lot more about how do we plan for growth, plan for our housing supply, how do we plan to be a more resilient community and respond to those needs. So I really thank you for the opportunity to be here, for the opportunity to seek the funds, and to invite a really talented design firm. I do want to recognize Sharon Rooney, who's here, who you all know, who worked with you extraordinarily well with the commission team on the Spring Bars Road project and the Davis Straits project. I don't know if you want to add anything more, Sharon?
No, not very much. But it's just great to be back in Falmouth, and yes, we had a lot of fun working with you a year or two ago on the Reset project for Davis Straits, and I think this project really fits very nicely with that project. As at the time we completed that study, I know that the board and the community had a lot of interest in pursuing a more compact form of housing, but didn't really know kind of yet what that would be, what form that would take. So that's the purpose of our work, and we have a great consultant here that's going to walk you through some options and get some input from the board and from the community about how we might proceed to provide a more compact form of housing going forward. And we also have Chloe Schaefer here on our staff, who I think worked with you on the Reset project, and I think that might be it for commission staff today. But great to be here, and we're here to listen, so thanks.
One last little data point. I love information. I was lucky enough to hear the national economist for the Home Builders Association last week, who gave his sort of forecast for the nation's economy as it relates to housing. And he gave us some information about the cost of permitting. And the cost of permitting nationally has grown by over almost 30% over the last 5 years. 15% of that cost of permitting is in the construction phase. So that's your building code, and we've all seen the building code grow from this to this in the last decades. But 15% of that is related to the pre-permitting, the pre-construction phase. So what you hear a little bit about today is about some of the tools that you might have available to you to get what the community desires and wants in the community, and perhaps makes that easier on the development community to respond. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and that is the end of my talking. I want to welcome Douglas Caulfels and Jeremy Lake from Union Studio out of Providence, Rhode Island. We're really lucky to have a very talented design firm here to help walk us through, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Thank you all particularly for putting together a special meeting for this presentation and this discussion. So my name is Douglas Caulfels. I'm managing partner of Union Studio Architecture and Community Design in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm here with Jeremy Lake, Senior Associate Project Manager, and Christina Carlson, who's also on our team. And Jeremy and I are going to sort of walk you through a presentation tonight. We'll try to move it along as quickly as we can. Before we get into sort of talking about the project, I just wanted to introduce our practice a little bit. We're a 22-person firm in Providence, and we were really founded in 2001, about almost 16, 17 years ago. Really, my partner and I, we both sort of cut our teeth doing sort of working for big firms in Boston and New York, and doing big institutional projects, and we really felt strongly that we had a lot to contribute as architects in communities and neighborhoods. And so we really wanted to start a practice that would focus on making a civic contribution to communities and neighborhoods of all types, and really to devote our skills to the creation and repair of places. And I think that speaks very much to the kind of work that we're talking about in this context. And that includes, obviously, restoring historic structures with care, because these really are part of our cultural heritage. But this also means that when we do new buildings and create public places, that these are built in a way that they really enhance the community, they add to the community, they enhance our civic life. And so that really is the framework for the way that we think about everything. And this really stems from a belief that so many principles of how to make great communities are things that we have forgotten how to do, or certainly or the forces of the marketplace have pushed us away from over the last 50 years. And that with careful application of the principles of healthy neighborhood design, we can create a framework for growth that I think it matches more closely with the kind of community we would like to have. And that creating a framework really is that. It's a framework that over a decade it might create the place that we want to have, but we need to start. We need to start somewhere. And some of these principles that are very close and near to our heart, I think are along the lines of many of the things I was speaking with the chairman earlier about a lot of these kinds of issues: walkable and pedestrian-friendly places, a mix of housing types that can meet the broad cross-section of the community, public spaces and amenities, very contextual architectural design, and equitable access to amenities. And an integrated use mix of uses and types and building blocks is really the framework and the cornerstone of a complete community place. And I think you know that when you look through the historic core of your community, and I think it's obviously why the Davis Straits area is such a focus for you. We have been very fortunate over the last decade or so to have done a fair number of projects out on the Cape over the years, both planning and architecture. And so these are just a couple of projects that we've done in the recent past. A large planning project in Sandwich, two of them actually. This was a competition that we recently won with the Cape Cod Young Professionals group for a small housing option and prototype for young professionals on the Cape. And these are a couple of projects that are completed and that we're about to start construction on. The upper left is Heritage Sands in Dennisport, which is a 63-unit cottage community, very compact cottage community. Brewster Landing in Brewster, and this project here, Sea Captain's Row, is a new workforce housing project in Hyannis, an infill project in a fairly challenging section of Hyannis that is going to begin construction in the fall. So why are we here? Basically, we're here to begin a conversation. This is the very beginning, I think, of a project that's going to go on through the remainder of the summer and into the fall, around strategies and techniques for meeting this increasing housing demand on the Cape. And to get input on you on ways to do this that are really going to enhance and support the character of your community. I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle here, for no question. And so I just wanted we really are at the beginning. We're here. And so this is really just the start of a discussion on this topic, and this will continue through the summer, hopefully with a robust online visual preference survey. We'll have a presentation at the One Cape Summit where we'll talk about our progress and what progress we're making, and then there'll be in the fall a second set of presentations back to the community where we'll talk about sort of what we've come up with after receiving all of this input. So we're beginning with 3 communities, of which Falmouth is one, and we hope that we'll be able to add a few other communities into this study. But one of the reasons that these communities have been chosen is that they represent conditions that we believe, when we develop techniques for these places, they will have applicability across the Cape as a whole. But as you mentioned earlier, another reason is that all of these communities have recently completed studies that have identified both the need and places where alternative housing strategies would be appropriate and where to target that kind of development. And all of these focus areas tend to focus on not on the sort of core of your historic Main Street here, but those areas that are the sort of hinge point between your single-family residential and what we would consider sort of a commercial core. And in the case of the Davis Straits area, that's obviously very evident. It's such a clear diagram here for me that there's this single-family neighborhood that comes right up and butts so strongly against what is obviously a large, big box sort of commercial area. So these are not in the single-family districts. And this is precisely where transitional density kind of housing strategies are important to consider as a way to knit the community more seamlessly together, so that you don't have these jarring sort of transitions from one type of one sort of character of your community to another. And this image up here is not from your community. This is actually from my home in my town. This is the edge of a single-family neighborhood, and this house butts right up against the parking lot of the of the grocery store and the liquor store. And it's just one of those examples when you see it, you know it, and you realize there's something missing here, and this is exactly the place where transitional, more dense housing, mixed-use types of strategies are the place that can make that, are the ways that you can begin to make those kinds of connections. So we really hope to deliver, at the end of this project, we're really hoping to deliver a series of moderate density housing prototypes that can be used to address these challenges in a variety of places on the Cape, and certainly in your community and in the Davis Straits area. And that includes dedicated housing as well as mixed use, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. We also want to begin to develop a framework for a form-based set of regulations that can assist your boards, your towns, your regulatory agencies, and help guide development in ways that are supporting the character that you want to see. And we'll talk a little bit more about the form-based codes at the end as well. But I think that's certainly one outcome of this project that we're very much hoping for. As I mentioned, we'll be at the One Cape Summit to sort of talk about where we've come. So Heather, I think, did a nice job sort of talking about the housing challenge in Cape Cod, so I won't go deeply into this, but there's no question that the Cape Cod Commission did a really wonderful analysis of the housing challenge on the Cape, and it's worth the read. I suspect all of you probably have done that, but it really highlights the really need for housing on the Cape over the next decade. Employment growth is certainly expected to increase and add quite a few number of residents. And at the same time, the limited supply of housing is driving up costs, and they're driving up costs at a rate that's outpacing salary increases, and rents are outpacing salary increases as well. So you've got house prices significantly outpacing what people are earning, and that's really becoming a challenge, particularly for your sort of broad base of socioeconomic band here on the Cape. And as Heather mentioned, the existing housing stock and new construction has been very much focused on single-family residential for so long. And that leaves the Cape, I think, fairly out of balance when it comes to providing housing options that can meet a really diverse range of needs. And that's obviously what we're here to talk about more. So the report concludes with a number of recommendations, many of which are near and dear to our heart, including diversity of multifamily housing and better urban design. I think when you put those together and imagine what they can do for knitting your community together, you have real opportunities to not only solve a housing challenge, but do so in a way that's going to add to the character of your community. But all of this is beginning to suggest, I think, that we need to have a discussion about density, which people tend to think is a scary thing. And I think what our presentation here is going to discuss really is, I think there are ways to talk about density that aren't really scary, and I think all of us getting our head around how to do that is the immediate challenge, and then showing everyone, the community, and you what that means is the next challenge. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who's going to walk us through the remainder of the presentation in a couple of ways that we might suggest we talk about that kind of density. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Douglas. And I apologize, this is kind of a funny setup, because obviously we're here to talk to you guys as much as we are here to talk to you guys. You feel like you got to choose which way you're going. And we're going to be showing some images on the board where we'd like to get your guys' input and feedback. So if at any point you feel like you need to move, I know I make a better door than a window, so I'm directly in the path of sight here. You're welcome to move. You can shift back. If you need to get out of here early, I won't mind if you just give me on by. It's all right.
Okay,
so
more people at home watching you from that camera. Good.
All right, all right. So let me go back to this. Is all density the same? Can we find options for density that feel right for our communities? We're here to talk about how density takes many forms. It's not one form. It comes many different ways, and that's really the big picture objective of our discussion here tonight. So what is density? When we're talking about housing, we're talking about basically how many residential units you can fit on a particular acre of land. So here's a series of diagrams. Obviously, if there's a single house on that acre of land, we say that's 1 unit per acre. If there are roughly 6 units in that same acre, 6 units per acre, you get the idea here. But that density can take many forms. This is a project we worked on in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. This is a lot that sits in one of those transitional areas that Douglas was describing. We don't give you much context, but you can kind of get a sense. Here's the back of a commercial building. Here's the commercial parking lot. And we also don't give you much context, but this really literally jumps then right into single-family residential fabric. And this was an empty lot, and it was zoned for multifamily. The town knew it needed some multifamily housing. And if you looked at the code and sort of played out the way it was expected to be played out, you would have ended up with a single 15-unit multifamily building, put right in the middle of the lot so as to be as buffered as far as possible from anybody else around them. And we thought there's got to be a better way. And oh, by the way, this doesn't really look particularly like anything around it. So the solution was to basically take that same number of units and instead of consolidating them, to spread them out. And so on the same parcel of land, instead of doing 15 apartments, we did 15 small cottages. So you end up with the same density. Both of these are 20 units to the acre. This is less than an acre of the lot that we were dealing with here. We consolidated the parking. There was a little greenway that went through the middle. So there were a lot of little clever things we had to do here. But the net result was that you have the same density in two very different forms. And in this case, you have a form, these small cottages, especially when the majority of them are actually back off of the street, that as you're going up and down the street, you wouldn't even have potentially noticed. It just looks like a few more single-family houses have been built there. So again, the raw number of 20 units to the acre wasn't really the issue at hand. It's really the form that that takes. So this is where I'm going to ask you guys, we're going to do sort of a little bit of a quiz here for a couple of slides. I'm going to show you two images, and I'm going to ask you on these first batch, which one do you think has the higher density? We're just going to do it with a little bit of an informal show of hands, okay? How about who in the room thinks that the image on the right is the higher density in this case? Any takers? Got one?
I know the owner, so
You already know the answer on this one? That's right. So it looks like everybody's going to show a hand for the image on the left.
yeah.
A lot of people, okay, good for all of you all. This building here has 5 units inside of it, and it's on a half-acre lot, which means it's 10 units to the acre. Whereas this house on the right, it doesn't matter exactly where it is. We're just calling this typical single-family home in Cape Cod, because the reality is once you get outside of those core areas that are our study areas, pretty universally you find that those tend to be quarter-acre, half-acre lots, which means you have a density of roughly 2 to 4 units per acre in the areas just outside of these study areas. So again, what we're contending is, again, you could be driving down the street, you'd go right by this house, you'd go right by this house. You wouldn't blink at the fact that the density just got 5 times higher going down to the next lot. All right, so now you know this one's doing pretty good. What do you think compared to this set of townhouses here? Who thinks the townhouses are the higher density in this case? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And what about the image on the left? Who thinks that house is still winning out on the density? Pretty much everybody else? One hand? A lot of people choosing not to vote. We're not keeping track. I'm not writing down the names. We're ready to go. It's all good. There's no grades with this. So this is a trick question because they actually both work out to be 10 units to the acre. So this townhouse community is in Orleans, 42 units on 4 acres, so that's also 10 units to the acre. So again, same density, very different forms. All right, how about between these two? Who thinks the image on the left has a higher density than the image on the right? I know they're kind of hard to make out on this projector, but anyone voting for the image on the left?
I'll go left.
1, 2, 3, 4. How about the image on the right?
We don't know how big the lot is, though.
So kind of split. So in this case, these are both duplex units. And on this one, there's 6 units on just about under an acre, so that's 8 units to the acre. This one is 10 units on 2 acres, so that's around 5 units to the acre. But Jim just made an excellent point that density is impacted not only by the buildings, but the way that they're arrayed on a site, how much open space is around them. So we're actually going to show both of these examples. We'll come back to these, give you a little more context and character so you'll understand how they fit in. But it's an excellent point. We were hoping you guys would all think that maybe this was just a big single-family house on its own lot, but in reality, it's a duplex. All right, last one for this first series of things. We've got this larger structure up here. We've got this cute little guy right here. I bet most of you know how we're trying to fool you on this one. Who's going to pick the one on the left as being the higher density? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, how about the one on the right? 1, 2, 3. A lot of people still not voting. All right. This project is roughly 22 units to the acre. This little building actually is literally a stone's throw from here. If we look out the window, it's right over here. And there's a collection of 3 buildings over there that have 9 units on almost a half acre. So that's 22 units to the acre. Whereas this project, which obviously looks like it's a big thing, it's 100 units on 6 acres. So that's 16 units to the acre. So this one wins out over this one just from a raw density calculation. So again, we're trying to get back to that idea of the density isn't the thing per se. All right, so what are some creative approaches to moderate and transitional density? So as a reminder, it's really these areas that we're here to talk about tonight. We're not worried about sort of what would go in these single family areas. It's really these areas that have been identified as places where we want to try to find creative ways of getting some more density, getting some more options for folks, different housing options, these transitional areas, if you will. And the good news is there's a whole range of building types that were built historically that fall somewhere between detached single-family homes. And in this case, the graphic shows a mid-rise apartment building, but you could just as likely think of that as your staples, right? And there's all these types, and we're going to talk about a great number of these, but these help you slowly transition to a slightly more dense, and so you can find the right place for each of these things in any given scenario. So these housing types were common in pre-1940s walkable neighborhoods. They provided housing options, denser housing options in forms that integrated nicely into a single-family community. So again, that could maybe be a little building with 6 units in it, sitting right next to 2 that are single-family homes. And so this was a really prevalent strategy back in the day for maybe infilling or retrofitting. You know, the new train line came through, suddenly a bunch more people wanted to live there. Instead of wiping everything out, you could sort of infill, and I think that's one of the strategies we'd want to consider here as well. And why is the missing middle missing? There's a couple of things. First and foremost, most zoning ordinances were rewritten post-World War II, and they focused primarily on single-family homes and on apartments. You either bought and lived in a house or you rented your apartment, and there really wasn't anything in between. We like to really simplify things back in the day. And as a result, financing was structured largely based on those 2 types and sort of continues to be to this day. And in addition, local residents tend to be hesitant about new types of development. So after a while, we got used to seeing those 2 things. And so if you propose something that's a little bit different, you got a lot of resistance a lot of times. So why is there a renewed interest in the missing middle now? I think we made reference earlier to the fact that empty nesters and young professionals are really looking for new options in historic quarters, areas where we have limited land. We don't have the ability to do big-scale projects. You're looking to infill in creative ways. We're looking for new models to help provide more affordable housing. The industry is looking for new ways to develop in smaller increments. After the crash in 2009, it got a lot harder to try to find financing to do a 400-unit project. Plus, most developers didn't want to get involved in a project that was going to take them 10 years. So everybody's looking for this smaller scale, incremental approach to providing new housing. And there's been a big demographic shift to right-sized units and communal living. So again, those empty nesters and young professionals, they aren't looking for the 4,000 square foot house, at least not at the life stage they're at now. And there aren't a lot of options for them other than those large single-family homes. And all of these things are things that these missing middle typologies can help address. So let's talk a little bit more about the missing middle building types. And for those of you that don't know what a building type is, because why would you? It's basically a way of thinking about and categorizing units that have similar dispositions. So, you know, a small single-family house we might call a cottage. When 2 units are attached to each other, they're called a duplex. You've probably heard of these things. A number of them attached we'd call a townhouse. When the units are actually set on top of each other instead of side by side, we would call those stacked flats. There's this one building type that we've not yet really found examples of on the Cape yet, but we think is an interesting one, where you take a few of those townhouses and you put them on top of one of those flats, and you go what we call towns over flats. Really creative with naming here. And the last one is what we call a multiplex, which is effectively a very small multifamily building. And the idea is that you could have a shared central circulation that could feed a couple of units on either side of it. But this is a very efficient building to build. You build one stair that feeds a few units. It's not the big building where you have the corridors going down and 3 sets of stairs and an elevator in the middle. So again, it's a more incremental way of thinking about providing housing. So let's go through those each one at a time quickly. Cottages are small-scale, single-family detached units. They're typically 1 to 2 stories. They may be attached, but they're typically not. Typically, they're detached. The real advantage to getting the density here is arranging them in what we will call cottage courts, and we'll show you some examples of those. And one of those is here, the image that Douglas showed earlier. This is Heritage Sands in Dennisport. So these are a series of cottages, obviously arranged pretty closely together. You gotta be clever about how you do that, but you can really get some pretty good densities out of those small cottages. The examples we found on the Cape ranged anywhere from 8 to 15 dwelling units per acre. There are examples of these, like the one in East Greenwich, that was closer to 20. So obviously those numbers aren't sort of set in stone, but that's what we found when we did our sort of analysis of examples, the ones we could find on the Cape. So with each of these types, we're going to share 2 examples that we found just for some context. Chase's Ocean Grove, Old Wharf Road in Dennisport. So obviously these are vacation cottages. Most of us probably wouldn't feel comfortable living in quite those close quarters. But in that roughly 4-acre site, there's 55 cottages, so that's 15 units to the acre. Again, we're talking about something in contrast to the 2 to 4 units per acre that the single-family housing we've typically built could provide. Now, the reality is when you probably build this in current day with current day standards and needs like a place to park maybe 1 or 2 cars, this is the Heritage Sands project. And so in 8 acres, we have 64 units. So again, the density got cut in half, or 8 units to the acre. But again, that's still 2 to 4 times as dense as what the typical single-family arrangement might provide. And I know it's very difficult to make out on this slide, but the way this works out is that you have about a dozen cottages facing in together in one of these little shared green spaces before you then transition to the next one, and they're on their own little cluster, So what's actually nice is this is a series of sort of smaller communities within a bigger community, and they're all interconnected. But again, this is one of the strategies that we might avail ourselves to. And because some of these examples in the Cape aren't necessarily the best versions, I think the cottages ones are really good, but you'll see in some of the latter ones that we had a hard time finding particularly inspirational versions of the things we wanted to talk about. We also just wanted to point out, again, that these things were prevalent once upon a time. There's new ones, there's old ones that are around the Cape, they're maybe in Rhode Island, maybe you have to look a little bit further, but they were prevalent. You can find these things in New England. And so, again, we're going to do 2 comparisons here. Again, we're going to get your guys' thoughts. That's what we're really here to do tonight, is to kind of spark a little bit of conversation and get your input. So what we're going to do is these sort of visual preference survey. We're going to put 2 images up. They might look largely similar, but we actually think there's some subtle differences between these. And we're going to ask you guys to vote which of the 2 versions do you think would feel more appropriate here. So assuming you were going to do this, you were going to use one of these 2 in the study area, the Davis Straits area, as a potential solution. Which one of these 2 do you think might feel more appropriate? So again, we're going to do a show of hands. Who thinks that the image on the left would feel more appropriate in the Davis Straits area? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll call it 9, probably about half of the group. How about the image on the right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, so we're about split 50-50, which is fair. How about, would somebody who voted for the image on the left share why they thought was the more appropriate? Anyone want to share their thoughts behind there? Yes?
Well, what we're looking at is greater density, probably putting in some streets that don't currently exist, bringing the dwelling units more towards the street, but more companionable streets to engender a greater sense of community. And I think that does it more than the one on the right.
How about somebody else who voted for the image on the left? A different thought behind it? Why they voted for it? Was it really the street? Yes, sir.
It just looks like more of a beach community there.
The one on the
It
left?
doesn't look like the neighborhood that we're talking about, to me.
So the one on the right looks more like a beach community?
Yeah. How about for the folks that voted for the image on the right? Some thoughts about why that one drew your vote instead? Yes?
I like the pedestrian aspect of it, not just the walkable neighborhood. It looks like it's more comfortable to walk down that path than road.
Different thought, yes, sir?
I like it because it does look like a beach community.
After the beach.
And I think it looks a little bit more like the single-family homes that are scattered throughout the rest of town, if you were cited there in the Davis Straits lot.
Okay, great input. We've got another image, so let's go to the next image and we'll do the same exercise. So we've got 2 images here. Again, we're talking about the Davis Straits area. If we were going to apply some of these here, which of these 2 do you think is more appropriate? How about the image on the left? Any takers for the image on the left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, how about the image on the right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9. So a few more votes maybe for the image on the right. How about for those that voted for the one on the right? What about it, about your vote, made you think that might be a little more appropriate than the one on the left?
Looks more like Falmouth, the other one looks like Virginia.
Okay, that's fair enough. I will point out that actually this one is that project in East Greenwich that we showed earlier, where we sort of spread out the cottages. So actually this is down in Rhode Island, but I think that's a good point. Anybody else?
I didn't vote for any of the 4 because, to me, I think a more appropriate scale is if you're familiar with what's happening in Mashpee Commons right now, and those sort of 3-story buildings that are mixed-use buildings that do look very Cape Cottage, but a little bit more dense. I think that Davis Straits is a much more commercial district, and I know that we want to create it to be a mixed-use district, but I don't think any of the 4 have the density or the scale that's appropriate for that particular street.
That's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
The Davis Straits plan actually has new roads on it that are really interesting, that would be parallel to Davis Straits, and it provides an opportunity for several different kinds. So it's hard not to vote for all of them, so that you're aware that you don't want it to look as if you picked one style and just plunked them all down. So any one of the four would be good, depending on where you put it. And yet I think it was Jim who brought up quite a while ago that for the part of Davis Straits that I think you're thinking about, where there'll be the greatest density, right along Davis Straits and maybe going back to Worcester Court, there's a road going down the middle. There's an opportunity there to have lower things near the main roads and higher away from the road where you won't be so aware of that height. So there's really a lot of options for different kinds of things rather than picking one or even two.
Yeah, because I think most people probably agree with you. Right on Route 28, this probably feels like it's a missed opportunity, whereas maybe out of the perimeter, where you're trying to transition back to the single-family areas, maybe this would be an option. Yeah.
The Davis Straits has what Mike was talking about on all the primary roads, and it has on the secondary roads more housing. You know, it has bigger buildings, much more prominent on the primary roads, and the secondary roads it has, you know, more different type of residential uses as well. So I think it has both.
Right. All right, well, let's keep moving because we've got a few more of these to get through. So the next one is the duplex. Again, I think most of you know what a duplex is. They're typically 1 to 2 stories. It's 2 single-family homes that share what we call a party wall, which makes it sound really fun to share a home with somebody. And these came in, the examples we found were in the 5 to 10 dwelling units per acre range, the ones that we were finding around the Cape. But obviously there's probably a great many examples of these. So the point you made earlier, when you look at this thing in an aerial, this is the Beechwood condos. You can see this is a very sort of suburban arrangement, right? These things are surrounded by a lot of space. They've got these big 20-foot buffers probably on the side and back, nice little green space in the front. But they also were in a context where they really weren't trying to necessarily fit in with their neighborhood. There wasn't much of a neighborhood to fit into. And the resulting density was 5 units per acre. And then if we compare that to the other image we shared with you guys, Old Dock Road in West Falmouth, you can see, you know, they were basically 3 buildings. You can see there's 3 duplex buildings that sit on this barely 1 acre lot, you know, 5-yard setbacks. But that's the appropriate thing to do in this particular context. So it really did probably have less to do with the buildings themselves and more about the way that they were arranged and arrayed upon the site. And again, a couple more examples of duplexes around the Cape, a couple from a few other locations as well. This was our project. This is a 40B project actually in Brewster that we showed earlier. So we had a handful of duplexes in the mix there as well. So let's go with these 2 images. So again, when we're talking about the Davis Straits area here in Falmouth, 2 very different images here. Who would select the image on the left being more appropriate in the Davis Straits area of Falmouth? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll call it 9. How about the image on the right? Who's going for the image on the right? This projector's a little rough, but that's a duplex. So there's actually a party wall right here. So you've got a big glassy open house here and a big glassy open house here. Obviously it's good that this guy can't see the neighbor in the bathrobe because they're orienting their views out to the... So it's a very contemporary, very modern kind of house. And that kind of style, it can be made to work, certainly in the sort of forms that we're talking about, but it can also be tricky. Like this one looks great because it's just out in the woods, right? There's no neighbor 10 feet away. And what's very interesting is this same slide, when we shared it in Orleans and Eastham last night, all the hands went up for the one on the right versus the left. But I think that's a good thing, that we're learning that there are these sort of particular characters to these places, what we consider acceptable or reasonable or what feels like Falmouth versus what feels like Eastham. There should be different answers, right? We're not trying to suggest that there's one solution for both. So this was actually kind of a very telling slide. Yes?
The Enterprise here in Falmouth runs a wonderful little special thing each week on what things looked like 40 or 60 years ago. And from following those, you can see that Falmouth took down most of its Victorian buildings. It took down the town hall, it took down all along Main Street and maybe further beyond. Wonderful, wonderful old buildings, more nearly like the one on the left there. And they were there, you know, so clearly they would fit back in. If you're saying the missing middle, there's a whole time range of missing styles that could be part of what we're thinking about in form-based zoning. It doesn't have to be just colonial or what we've come to call traditional. The tradition included, you know, 300 years worth of stuff, and we've erased 150 years of it.
Absolutely. That's great. That's a great point. Okay, let's go on. I think that was only the first image. So how about between these 2 images? For the Davis Straits area of Falmouth, who thinks the image on the left would be the more appropriate version between these two? Crickets. Okay, how about the image on the right? Okay, why not the image on the left?
Only 1.5 stories.
The scale feels a little too low? Yes, ma'am? Garages, we're not feeling the garages in the front? Yeah, that's a good.
Feels very suburban with the garage, I think.
Feels very suburban with the garages in the front? Yep, agree. We also thought it was interesting, this one looked like it was two small cottages that somebody just kind of pushed up together. This one was designed to feel like it was a single home, a single structure, unified design. So there's a little bit of that in there too. We were wondering if anybody would kind of pick up on that, but that's great, okay. All right, the next type is the townhouse, again, which is a series of single-family units, typically more vertically arranged, that have a series of party walls. So these guys are even more sociable. Typically 2 to 3 stories. These buildings can be designed to look like individual units, like the example you see here, right? Like every one of those looks like its own home. Well, there are plenty of examples also where you might design a 3 or 4 unit building just to look like one cohesive composition. We'll show some examples of that. So a couple of options there. This is the density starting to get a little bit higher, 6 to 12 units to the acre for the versions we found on the Cape. Again, this is another type that in other parts of the country, you can get up to 20 units per acre on townhouses, still have them feel pretty good. Also depends on what kind of townhouse it is. Again, we're not going that deep here today. But another type that we wanted to talk about. One of the examples, this is in Orleans, Anthony Drive. There's 10 units, plus a little bit of retail here at the front end, so it's starting to be a little bit of a mixed type community on 1.5 acres, so 6 units to the acre. Again, this has the same problem as the image we were talking about a minute ago, a lot of front-loaded garages. They really kind of detract from the sense of the community, unfortunately, although the buildings themselves are pretty nicely detailed. And now Bayberry Village, this was one of the other images we showed earlier. 42 units on 4 acres, so that's 10 units to the acre. Again, a very suburban sort of arrangement. This whole staggering of the townhouses is a very suburban treatment as well. So again, I don't think that would necessarily be appropriate for the Davis Straits area. But again, these were some of the examples of townhouses that we found on the Cape to help us get a sense of what people might be more used to here. But here are several examples of townhouses in other locations. Again, here you can see, that's a series of 4 townhouses, but in a composition that looks more like one single building versus one where you're stepping things or changing materials to make them different. There's different contexts where those different approaches make sense. So there's a couple of different ways to take these. So again, two images to get your thoughts on. Here's 2 variations for the Davis Straits area. Who would say the image on the right feels more appropriate? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 or 9. How about the image on the left? 1, 2, 3. All right. Why did folks choose the image on the right?
The one on the left looks like a country estate, sitting on 5 acres.
Okay. That's a fair point.
Most townhomes are sold versus rented, and I've always believed that when people go home, they want to feel like whether they're rental or buying, that they're going into their home. And I think that individuality of those townhomes is much more marketable than the big building.
Anybody else want to offer up a thought? Okay, those were good observations. This one's obviously in Providence, not obviously in Providence, but it is in Providence. We were joking you could tell it's in Rhode Island because the asphalt's all broken up in front. This is actually student housing in Middlebury, Vermont, but it was designed basically as a series of townhouse units, so 10 students share each of these modules. But even yesterday people picked up on this. It doesn't feel like it's in a very urban environment. This feels like it's sort of out in the countryside, and it is in fact. This one we were trying to show, again, the idea of one, like a sort of singular composition versus individual units, and so I think you made an excellent point there relative to that. How about between these two? Would anybody in the room pick the image on the left over the image on the right for being more appropriate for the Davis Straits area? Or anywhere in the country? So what is it about the image on the left that we're not feeling?
Stucco?
What was that?
Is it stucco?
It's not stucco. It is siding, but again, it's hard to make out with the... Oh, this was a good time to make a plug. You guys need new technology here on your projectors.
It's trying too hard.
Yeah.
It's trying too hard.
Yeah.
How long?
It's awkward.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's awkward.
It's awkward. A lot of weird things going on, the bumps, the grooves.
Yeah.
Obviously, someone was trying to make every townhouse feel like its own McMansion, and it's not really working out.
And the windows change everything. The shape of the windows is a huge impact.
Mhm. Yeah, this
There's
feels,
Palladian,
this
there's-
feels more contextual
Yeah.
and appropriate. This feels a little bit 1988 or 1992, right? Yeah, very
California
dated.
or someplace else, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. We won't do any of these Palladian movies in our business. All right, let's move on to the stacked flats. So again, this is the notion of stacking single-story units on top of each other. This is that example that's literally around the corner from here. Typically 2 to 3 stories, which is to say it's typically 2 to 3 units for one of these little configurations. But what we try to show here is you could be a standalone version like this, or there are examples where you can attach a couple of those, just like you would townhouses, and get more units in a single building. 10 to 15 units per acre, and typically for these, we find that they may have independent circulation. Again, hard to make out in this image, but the first floor unit actually has its own set of steps and a front door here, whereas the second story unit actually has a stair on the side that you could go up and get into the second story unit there. So each person would have their own front door, someone could get there, they could have their own address, which is kind of charming and nice. The 2 examples that we wanted to share, one is the Captain Hamlin House in West Falmouth. This is a 1-acre lot. There was a historic home on the front and what we think was probably some sort of barn or outbuilding in the back. Someone converted that to 9 units on a single acre. So again, 9 units to the acre, but you drive by this all day long and never realize that there were that many units in there. And then the example that's here around the corner. So here's the green right in front of us here. It's a town hall somewhere here-ish in the site plan. So there's one building here, another building here. They both have 2 units. This little guy has 5 mailboxes on it. So we're wondering, are there really 5 units in that building? There may be. But this is also the Oddfellow Hall behind here. But we were translating this to be 9 units in roughly half an acre, which is why it's probably around 22 units to the acre. If we don't buy that there's 5 units fitting in that building, we just said, imagine it's another 2 units there. The adjusted density is probably around 15. But again, compare that to 2 to 4 in a typical single-family kind of context. And again, examples of these in other places, sometimes they can really be made to look like a little carriage house or outbuilding, a converted house here, something a little more urban here, a little more vertical, that's that converted building. So these can, again, take many shapes, sizes, forms, so they can look like they belong in a variety of contexts. So we're going to ask the question again. In this case, who thinks the image on the right that is in Falmouth is the more appropriate version to put in the Davis Streets area? And that doesn't mean that that's the right answer. I shouldn't have led it that way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, how about the image on the left? Is anybody in support of the image on the left?
I think that it's going to have to be an eclectic mix. That whole area is going to be a lot of different stuff.
Mhm.
Like Sharon said, it's going to be a lot of diversity in order to make it work.
Mm-hmm. Are we worried about a 3-story scale? Is a 3-story scale reasonable in the Davis Straits area?
I think so, in the middle part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, in the middle.
In the middle, maybe not at the edge. Yep.
Kind of like a
Or even
garden,
on the streets,
little
it's
stuff in
maybe,
front.
Some of them,
depending on how it's done.
Yeah.
it
Okay.
has to go up and down.
Because obviously the difference between doing it 2 stories and 3 stories is doing 2/3 the density in a building you're already building, the foundation's there, the roof's there, right? So there's something to be said about doing it if it makes sense, if it feels appropriate.
But I'd still like to have a little pitch on the roof, so we might have to
I was
work
gonna
on
ask you, I was gonna ask you that, flat.
we might have to work on our height limitations.
Yeah, so he was just making the point that if the height limitations are forcing flat roofs on a 3-story building,
Yeah.
that might be a missed opportunity. It's a problem where Douglas is facing that firsthand in the project we have in Bristol, Rhode Island. Everybody's like, we don't like the flat roof. It's like, well, we came in 2 weeks ago and showed you a pitched roof, but asked for a variance. We said, oh, we don't want to give you a variance. It's like, kind of have to make a decision or a choice there, right? So, how about between these 2 images? Who thinks the image on the right is more appropriate in Falmouth in the Davis Straits area? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Call it 8. How about the image on the left? 1, 2.
Looks like Cambridge.
Yeah.
How many folks are intentionally not voting because they're abstaining from choosing either one of these?
Sometimes.
No?
Well, when I
Okay.
see the older houses, I think of the Zelinsky house that just got torn down and that was there. And there were some older houses and older barns along that section of T-ticket. So.
It's just sort of interesting to me is I look at the one on the left and it reminds me of a lot of the units that have been put in Cambridge around Porter Square. And I look at the one on the right and that would never go in around that area. And maybe because I'm still relatively new to Falmouth. But it's not that I couldn't see that one going somewhere in Davis Straits. It's just, I look at it and it screams of a different urban area.
Mm-hmm. So something about its character is too urban.
Well, it just
for
seems out of
Falmouth.
context to me.
And I think the porches is something we have around our town. A lot of our older houses have porches, and
Right.
it's nice sidewalks and talk to people, neighborhoods.
Yeah, I was waiting to see if anybody would raise that issue, that, again, people see different things in these images, so some people point out the grass versus the concrete, but we heard last night a lot of conversation about porches too. People chose one or the other because of a porch, but porches are something that seem to be pretty popular, generally speaking.
The one on the left, and I'm not sure, it looks like a two-family. And we have found, because we've renovated a lot of those in New Bedford, that two-family units are very important because it really allows people to qualify to buy a home. That rental income from that second unit really helps first-time home buyers qualify, because the bank will count that income towards count that rent towards their income, which helps them. So I haven't seen any images besides that one of potential two-family units.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at trying to increase some home ownership there, that would probably be a good model.
So I should point out on this one, this is actually 3 units. This is what we would call a triple decker.
Yeah.
And this is actually, technically, this is a mixed-use building, believe it or not, but we put it in here so that you could imagine that maybe it's 4 units that are in this building. And it's interesting you say that, because in Providence, right now, the hottest thing to buy are the little 2- and 3-unit buildings. Young professionals, if they can make it happen, they realize they can get that income from the rental unit. And suddenly, pretty quickly, the rental income is paying the mortgage. It's a pretty clever thing, so people are coming around on this idea. Yes?
The one on the left, this sort of drags us off the topic a little, but maybe it's good to bring it up early on in the project. Brings up the whole issue about telephone poles. Look at that thing right there at the corner of the building. And it detracts from the entire thing. And if you put telephone poles into any of them, you would make them far more realistic, because that's what we live with now. But it could be in Davis Straits. We don't have to if we plan well.
That's great.
The foundation height too. You've got a higher foundation height on the left.
This one?
Yeah.
Yep.
Bring that closer to what the actual streetscape is.
Depends on what the flood zone is.
Yeah.
That's true.
Actually, we know that is an issue, right?
Yeah.
Davis Straits, so that's a good point. That's something we should actually think about. Okay. All right, we've got 2 more of these to go, so I'll move a little bit quicker. Towns over flats. Again, this is an example from Virginia, so we haven't found a lot of good examples of these on the Cape, if any examples on the Cape. This one we don't think is necessarily appropriate here per se, but if this was the clearest diagrammatic version of one of these things. And so what's kind of clever is because it sits on a corner, you can have one door on the side that's the entry to the flat downstairs, and on the front there were a pair of doors that take you to a stair that would lead you upstairs, and there's a townhouse on the right and a townhouse on the left. So this building actually has 3 units, the upstairs 1- or 2-story units, and then you have a flat on the ground floor. And this also shows how this one actually fit kind of nicely into what was otherwise a townhouse neighborhood. These are typically 3 stories because the townhouse itself obviously has to be at least 2 stories, and this is a flat below. Best on the corner for the multiple entries. But look at the density, right? So now we're starting to get it be up like 15 to 20 units per acre. So the density is starting to get up there with being comparable with a big mid-rise building, but in a compact form that might fit nicely between other things in a particular area.
Sir, if we were to change our height regulations to do something like that, what is the height of that building?
I would guess that this building is probably 30 feet to about here, and then depending on how you measure the ridge, this one probably was at about 35 to the midpoint of the ridge, call it 40 to the top of the ridge.
40, so it's 5 feet higher than we currently have now.
And I would say,
And a full story. We're at 2.5 stories. That's 3.5
I
stories.
know.
Yeah, and if you have flood pressure in Davis Straits, that's going to impact things even further, right?
So if we have to start at 10, and I can only go to 35, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So here's a couple of examples. We found in Provincetown, there was this guy, which is really more of like a cottage over a studio apartment, but it's starting to kind of be this idea of a 1.5 stories over a single flat. In Providence, a few examples of there's a door for a flat downstairs and a door that takes you upstairs to a 2-story unit up above. And this is that project that Douglas was talking about we're working on in Hyannis. Technically, none of these are a townhouse over a flat, but you could really see these as being that. So it's an example of, again, the form is more important than what's really behind it. Those are actually a series of stacked flats. And we wanted to try to find another image that could represent this building type that we're trying to share today. So again, we'll do a quick show of hands. How about the image on the left being more appropriate for Falmouth Davis Straits? 1, 2, 3. How about the image on the right? 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're starting to get in the territory where people don't want to vote. Okay, so a number of people not wanting to vote on this one. This one's tricky because this doesn't feel anything like the Cape, right, in terms of its character. And this one feels like a little scrappy. Like it even looks like it's starting to sink into the ground back here. So this is kind of a tough one. But again, this was a unit type that we think has merit, but we're having a really hard time finding precedent for it here.
We have a bank on our East Main Street that was built just a few years ago that looks a little bit like that.
How about between these two images? It's really hard to make out. This is Commonwealth Avenue in Back Bay of Boston. Here you have basically, 4-story mansions on top of very expensive studio apartments, right? And then this is one of those examples from Providence. Can anybody see this scale working in Davis Streets? No, we've definitely pushed the limits here, right?
Just over the line.
But how about the one on the right? Could we imagine the one on the right maybe working somewhere in Davis Straits?
Yep.
Yes? We're getting to 3 stories, but it's still sort of a single increment of that, not a bunch of them all attached in a big row, so.
But it's the material too. The one on the left is brick.
Yes.
It's stone.
It's stone, brownstone, that's
The
right.
one on the right is shingle. More natural.
Do we think there's an opportunity for brick in Falmouth?
I think we can make some.
Limit it a bit? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if you look, you find it, right? Like you don't imagine it, but you look, you find it. Okay.
Mixtures of it.
So the last one of the missing middle types we wanted to talk about today, the multiplex. Again, this example is actually a mixed-use building there, but it fits so neatly into the diagram we're trying to share that you can imagine there's a front door here in the middle that you could go in. There could be 1 or 2 units on either side. You go up the stairs, there's a few more units, you keep going up. These are typically 2 to 3 stories. They're anywhere from 4 to 12 units per building. So there's a provision in the building code that if you're going to do that single central stair, the most you can do is 12 units. And the most you can do is 4 per floor on 3 floors. There's a logical code restraint there for not going past 12. But you can also find a lot of examples of things where maybe there's 1 unit on the left, 1 unit on the right, and the stair only goes up 1 floor. And that's why it might be only 4 units. So these things kind of shrink or grow anywhere in that kind of 4 to 12 unit range. In the examples we found on the Cape, 15 to 25 units per acre. So again, these are legitimately a multifamily building. They're just a very small scale multifamily building. The one that we shared at the very beginning, you might remember this guy had 5 units in that single structure, so 10 units per acre as a result. You can see that even sat, it didn't even use a lot of the land it had around it, which is probably why it also fits kind of nicely into its surroundings. And this was that other project, the Rock Harbor Village. This is in Orleans. And what's hard to make out here is even though these look like big buildings, what they really are is a bunch of these that's a little grouping of 4 units. So there's a front door here and there's 4 units that use it. And there's another little grouping that's attached to that one that had its own front door and another 4 units. So this is a series of those multiplexes connected so that it looks like a bigger thing than it really is. And it's kind of nice because any given person, you're only sharing that front door with 3 or 4 neighbors, right? It's not one door to a complex of 30 units. But that's 16 units per acre, 100 units on 6 acres. So here are some other examples that we found. Again, we found a lot of them, right, that look like a really big house, or maybe a historic inn is another way of thinking about these. There's a lot of historic inns on the Cape that you could imagine could be converted to 6, 8 units, and it would work all day long. A couple of examples of other things in other places. So these are actually our second to last pairings, but let's talk about these real quick. Image on the left versus image on the right. How about image on the left being more appropriate for the Davis Straits area in Falmouth? And the takers for the one on the left, a little dated, a little boring. How about the building on the right? Could folks see something like that working here?
Yeah.
Got a few folks there. What is it about the building on the right that feels a little more appropriate?
More detail.
Classic architecture.
More detail, more interest, classic architecture.
It doesn't go out of style.
Doesn't go out of style. Now this is a flat roof building, but it's appropriate for this sort of Victorian style. Are we okay with a flat roof if it fits into the right style, or is that still an issue for some
As
people?
long as it doesn't look like you're just trying to chop the top off and make it fit.
Celebrate the top, maybe it's okay.
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 Are there stairs going up from this, on other examples, it shows you're able to get into the first floor just by walking up the sidewalk and the green space. But here you have to climb stairs.
This was an interesting discussion we had last night as well about the challenge of when you elevate the building a few feet. Now that was a pretty common thing that they used to do for a variety of reasons, but one that is not insignificant is when the building is relatively close to the sidewalk. When your door is at the same level as the sidewalk, it feels really uncomfortable. Like it feels like people would just, like kid on his bike would just kind of take a turn to get your living room.
Yeah.
And the idea of having a little bit of separation, you know, when you're looking out your window, you're not staring directly at the person walking by. But that's a challenge these days if we're thinking about aging in place and accessible needs.
But if you have green space in front of you, then you can just right at the edge of the road.
So maybe you pull it back from the road a little bit and create that buffer.
A little bit of space, a little bit of garden.
There's also examples, we've done versions where maybe there's a few steps in the front because there's the pressure there to do that, but maybe in the back there's a reasonable way of doing that where
Put a ramp.
maybe there's some version of a ramp. Yep, those are all good points. But that's a legitimate consideration we need to make here as well, is access, and so that's a good point.
Maintenance on stuff like that, doesn't it come to play too? I mean, sometimes you get them too detailed and too many features, you know, they cost the maintenance of keeping them up versus.
They can be, and certainly the more detail you
No,
put on
like
there.
the right, it's got great detail on it. You know, unless they have big funds and stuff to keep up the buildings, you're gonna start having.
I think that's a good point. I would argue that at the same time though, oops, didn't mean to hit that button. This building's probably been around a lot longer than this building, and people have been willing to do that maintenance.
That's what I mean, you have to have
There's-
something in place so that, you know, you protect the maintenance.
Right, or you have to make it at least something that's lovable, something that somebody's willing to do that maintenance, they're willing to get up on the ladder and paint it every, 6 years. Versus we heard a lot of people kind of like, it looks so dumpy. You know, I feel like if somebody proposed tearing this down, you would hear an hour from them. Whereas if somebody was going to propose tearing this one down, you'd probably have a lot of people turn off. So it's a valid point, but I think there's some things that kind of balance that out, if that makes sense.
I think instantly with the right of parking issues, and if you put that in the city center, you can walk to public transportation, but here you would need ample parking for the number of units that it would have, so you'd need a corresponding parking lot or...
That is an excellent point. It's one thing we've kind of avoided, because we've been talking specifically about the buildings. You know, we've alluded to the fact that the way you actually plan for these and place them on the ground has a big impact, and you're right. Unfortunately, if everybody still has one car per unit, even though we can get pretty creative about how we make the housing itself more compact, the cars are always the cars, and they only sit one way, because we don't have very cheap ways of stacking them the way we would stack units. So it's a valid point. So as you get to these higher densities, it would be ideal if the parking counts could go down, if you could make a justification for that. Maybe if you're in a mixed-use town center in Davis Straits and all your needs are 5 minutes away, fewer people are choosing to own a car, they can take the bus, they can walk into town, so on and so forth. But it's a great point that the parking becomes a real challenge as the densities start to go up. If you have the same expectations of parking as you
You
would
have a
with a lower
communal
density.
parking garage as part of the whole package.
Could be.
And as the new guy in town, how do we feel about cement clapboards and AZEC for suite houses like this on the right? So you have low maintenance materials that you're constructing
It's
with.
not a historic district, so why not? And you might want to consider, are you going to have engineering studies to show what kind of elevations you're going to have to deal with?
I think we want to wrap our heads around that issue a little bit more. Probably. So at the end of the day, what we're really developing are these prototypes that could be utilized in these areas. So it's not to say we're literally, designing the neighborhood where we don't necessarily have to get into those issues. But I do think we owe it to everyone to understand the issue enough to know that if the reality is that all of the things we would propose would have to be 8 feet out of the ground, we should have a response for that or an approach for
Plan to
that.
put parking under the buildings and do something like that.
That should be part of the building.
Right.
Yeah.
That pressure is there.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if you've shown all the different types of housing styles, but one thing that we have a lot of in this community and that we desperately need now are residential hotels, which provided housing for our workforce here. Small rooms in 2-3-story buildings, very dense, minimal parking, and it's a housing type that we desperately need. Otherwise, it's going to be harder and harder for us to have our seasonal workers here because they don't have any place to live. So I hope examples of those that maybe you add that so that folks get to see what those look like. Because I think Davis Straits area is an appropriate location. That's sort of the center of commerce there, and employment base there, very strong, mostly lower wage folks, and having something like residential hotels. They're called SROs or micro units, but that type of housing style and stock is going to be
As an option for seasonal workforce housing, if nothing else. No, I think that's a good point. It's something we should definitely talk about. It's a good point. It's not something we were showing tonight, but I think it's a good question. Okay, so let's move quickly here on this image, one on the left, one on the right. I have a sense of probably how folks are going to vote, but let's see. Who thinks the image on the left is more appropriate for Davis Straits area? Don't be surprised. 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How about the image on the right? 1, 2, 3, 4.
You're gonna need somebody in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think this feels like it would make more sense sort of at the residential edges maybe, if you're still trying to get some density. This might feel like it makes more sense at the core. Okay.
And I also think from a cost standpoint, we need to simplify nicely our buildings too. The amount of detail that's on that building to the left just will not make these projects as affordable as I think we need to make them. So I think simplicity, well done with the right material is more important than the amount of gingerbread that's on them.
That's a great point. Again, we've heard it now a few times, the notion of making sure that the stuff is affordable, reasonably affordable, because that's one of the real challenges that we're trying to address at the same time. So that's great. Okay, so basically the last point we wanted to make is we also know that this area should probably have some mixed use in it, right? We're still going to want some commercial activity along the core. And one of the things we want to show is that a number of these types, like the townhouses or the stacked flats or even the multiplex, could effectively just be lifted up on a single story of retail, and you've essentially created a mixed use building. And that's something that we can find all over the Cape. There's any number of these buildings that have a single story of retail on the ground floor. You can see this is probably 4 units up here. This is a building in Rhode Island where that's a retail ground floor, but these are these 2-story townhouses that are on top. And you can imagine this is a building that's probably got 4 units over some retail. So there's various versions of these, various iterations of these, but we do think that talking about mixed use is important, and we would imagine you would agree in the Davis Straits area. We don't want to just turn that into a residential area. It's still going to have a commercial presence, particularly along Route 28. So again, we just wanted to show that a number of the things we've been talking about still work even as a mixed use option. So we were going to do quick voting on this one. I will just let you know that the thing we were trying to show here was the notion of these buildings. Most of the buildings we've been showing are about 5 feet off of the curb. Is that appropriate on Route 28? Could it be?
Well, that's what we've done in East Main Street development. That's the option they have to put parking in the back and the buildings close to the road to kind of extend Main Street. I don't know if we want to keep going all the way, but I think the original concept that we saw was there was some green space between the road and the buildings. That more walkable space.
Which is kind of what this was starting to show. Again, it's kind of hard to make out in this image. This is also a very different conversation in Eastham. Again, one of the other study areas that we've been talking about. Route 6 is going right through the area that they're talking about trying to make their core. That's a 4-lane highway right through the middle of there. So the context of Route 28 compared to Route 6, again, we need to, since we're thinking about all of these different conditions, we need to come up with clever solutions for all of those conditions. So to your point, it's easier to picture this here. It was very difficult to imagine doing something like that on Route 6 as it goes through East Hampton. So, yes, sir.
See, we've got a hotel that's going to be going in right just before you get to this area here. So we want things that people are going to be able to walk from a hotel and walk around, window shop, go to restaurants or whatever. So that scale close to the street, I think is appropriate for them.
Yeah, and we all know the benefits of that too, right? The stuff that's out there now is 200 feet off the street, and so that's definitely not what we're trying to do.
You've got to drive from one to the other.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, one of the things that we had talked about when we were doing the reset study too, and looking at pictures like this, is we didn't particularly want to create a wind tunnel effect that they're all 5 feet. We like the variegation there so that you can maybe have a bench to sit on in a particular area, and so some were closer, some were further away.
Yep, I think that's a great point. Great idea. Yes, ma'am.
Would this allow for a patio for a restaurant? Was there having seating in the front?
It certainly could, and again, some of this is getting beyond, our scope is really the buildings more so than the planning, but I think these are all excellent conversations to keep having. So sometimes,
Main Street in Elm.
yeah,
They try to do that, and they could find the customers like the outside, small, so ready.
right, at least enough space that you could, even just one row of cafe tables would make a huge difference. Yeah, that's a good point. And then these were the other 2 images we want to show. This one I do want to get people's feedback and thoughts on. Who would think that the image on the right would be more appropriate for the Davis Straits area? How about the image on the left? Could we see the image on the left being appropriate to the Davis Straits area? A few hands there. So I can imagine why people are not feeling this one, but I'd like to hear it from you guys. What's the challenge with the image on the right?
Just too big and bulky and not broken up.
Large, very large scale. Anybody else want
You need transition versus just bulk.
Oh, is that open on the first floor?
So it's retail on the first floor.
But is it solid? Is it
It is solid, yeah, there's no breaks in that building. And this image is actually cropped, it keeps going for another half block down the road too, which is kind of incredible. But obviously, this speaks a little bit, go ahead.
That way of disguising the top floor, it's actually a flat top building, and they've tried to disguise that by putting a slight slanty gambrel effect to it, broken by fake gables. It's too common, you see it everywhere, and it looks bad every single time.
So you're not convinced?
No.
You weren't fooled?
But that's almost a full 4 stories. It's not even 3.5, it's 3.8 stories or more.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely a full 4-story building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels very much like Mashpee Commons.
Yep. So I think this is a good example of that pre-recession. You got the big financing, you put in the 150 unit building with retail below. It's harder and harder to do this, and obviously you would need a big site to do that. Now, the Davis Straits area does kind of offer that, right? The Falmouth Plaza where the Christmas tree shops and the Staples.
Mm-hmm.
You do actually have a lot that you could imagine somebody could potentially propose one of those along the frontage of Route 28. And that'd be kind of a tough challenge to talk through. We think most of the rest of the area, you're going to have smaller lots where you would imagine things coming in more incrementally. It's why your Main Street looks the way it did, right? Because it's not like one person built the whole Main Street. People over time built the next, the next, the next. So that's probably what's going to feel more appropriate and be more realistic for most of the area that we're talking about.
Well, just a local note from what I've understood, if you start talking about getting rid of Christmas tree shop, you're going to have an issue. So you can talk about maybe you could order online from Staples, but everyone loves a bargain. You got to go to Christmas tree shop. Not a solicitation or commercial, but.
Well, out of all the retail, I mean, Christmas tree shop, it's funny. Every one of them's a little bit different. Some of them are, it's a little tacky, but it's not at the same, like they're pretty, at least they're trying, right? Staples isn't trying,
Have you
but
seen the original one?
Is the original one right when you get over the?
In Yarmouth Point, the
Yeah.
little one?
Yeah.
It's like a little general store.
Oh, really?
Oh, it's not?
Yeah, it's changed.
Is the building still there?
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I think we want to, Douglas, do you want to speak quickly about form-based
Again,
regulations?
I can do it right from here. I think just very quickly, I think all of this is, I think, illustrated for us that I think any one of these forms, any one of these densities can be appropriate if the character of it is correct, if the scale of it is right, if the detail of it is right. And that's really why form-based regulation of some type is a critical piece of the puzzle, because it's not so much what's behind the facade, it's what the form of these buildings are like. So make that right, and then whatever happens behind it happens behind it. So, and conventional, as I think you guys all know, and I suspect much of the community does too, conventional zoning really just looks at dimensions, and that's it. Say your building can be this tall, it has to be this far back from the street, it has to be this far back from your side yards, and anything that you can put in there, and here's your density allotment, anything that you can put in there is what's allowable in the community. A form-based code takes the opposite tack. It says, what is it that you want your community to feel like, and it lets all of that other stuff become secondary. So basically, these kinds of codes are based on community input, analysis. It takes a fair amount of effort, but they're based on understanding what it is that is your context. This just happened to be a form-based code that we worked on in a community in Rhode Island, and we spent a good deal of time sort of documenting what it is that was the context of the community and using that as a basis for what the form-based regulation should be. And then that translates into a series of code and regulatory tools that your boards and your community can use to help incentivize the kind of development that you'd like to see to preserve the character and enhance the character of your community. So it's just a little bit of a plug for, I think that's at the end of this. I think we will begin sort of the outline of framework for what a form-based either design guideline or regulation could be. But I think it's an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to imagining what the character of the community is going to be, particularly in the Davis Straits area over the long term. I know Jeremy had one more quick thing you wanted to
very quickly, which is what we've really already been talking about all around, which, again, just as a reminder, when we focus on the Davis Straits area, the penultimate question we were here to really ask you guys tonight is could any or all of these options fit into your community? And I think as we talked about it, I think there were a few folks who said, well, this might almost be too low a scale, maybe in a few limited areas, but we might want to be thoughtful about the cottage scale. And certainly when we got to the upper end, we started to hear a little bit of murmuring, especially when they got to be a little bit bigger and wider, and especially in the mixed use examples. But we did want to kind of circle back to this and just offer up a general opportunity to talk this through a little bit. That now that we have talked about density and what's really important is the way it looks, not necessarily the numerical value. But that all said, have we convinced you that any of these could work here? Are you guys still strongly opposed to cottages as we talked about it? Or are you thinking this really just doesn't make any sense? We just wanted to kind of circle back and have one last chance to be able to talk through these. Because again, it's not that we were necessarily even wanting to suggest that all of these make sense here. You know, it may be that only a limited number of them do. Or maybe it is better to have a bunch of options. But this is what we wanted to kind of throw out as one final question for the group to discuss.
I would say that just my anticipation would be that you'd have nicer architecture and more higher end, more expensive units on the periphery, and then larger, simpler buildings in the middle that you could really increase the density, as Mike was saying, the micro units, simple architecture that can be really affordable. We really need some affordable units if they can be squeezed in there and not be really in our face.
So having a range of options lets you do a range of price points. That's an excellent point.
We also have a huge amount of, H1 or the European students that come here to work in the summertime, and they don't have cars. If you drive around our town, there's certain motels that they've taken over, okay, and you drive in there, and they got 200 rooms, there's not a car in the place, they bring a bus in to get them, and everyone's on a bicycle, and they're in this neighborhood. And they all drive the same kind of bike, and we need them to we need them. So maybe some of these places, they don't have a place to park, but they have a second and third floor, small little apartment, place for their bike. Mix that in.
Yeah.
Because we need them.
We're going to have to make exceptions on parking.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the way to do it, is plan on some of them, people that don't have a car, but still will be here at least seasonally to work and help in housing. And they could be in small little units tucked away,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
I think we have an opportunity, based on those little side streets off of the main road, to really have quite a variety. I mean, I think because of the area, smart growth makes such sense to me. To have retail, where people can walk to a convenience store, where people can walk to have their hair cut, so that there's no burning need to have a car, except to get out of here. But, I mean, I think that there's just tremendous possibility, and I love the idea of just varied looks. I mean, aesthetically, I think we have tremendous opportunity.
I mean, certainly the areas we love the most probably in Falmouth have the most variety.
Yeah.
Right down Main Street.
Exactly.
Everything's a little bit different. You know,
Right.
There's no two that look alike. That's great. Yes, sir.
Could you go back to the site plan, please? So, the site plan on the right-hand side, what areas are you talking about when you show us all these duplexes and fourplexes?
So the idea is that the area that was identified in the reset study, so it's this dashed line that comes around like this. So this is Falmouth Plaza. I won't know all of the different buildings. The color coding was the fact that there were these different character zones even within there.
So the red is Falmouth Plaza.
Red is Falmouth Plaza. I think there's like a 99 restaurant over
The blue
here.
or the gray to the left is all commercial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this area is largely commercial at the moment.
So the only residential portion, business, is the upper right-hand portion. So when you show us all these visions, are you talking about all of this changing over a period of 40 or 50 years, or?
Potentially.
And one main street going through the middle, or you see side streets, or?
So I think we are building on the efforts of the reset study. The reset study certainly showed the idea that there would still be Route 28, obviously, as the main thoroughfare, that there would be a network of streets in here that would create a series of blocks in that area, more akin to what you would find once you get outside of this area, right? You know, it starts to be smaller scale blocks. So the idea is that what we're talking about are basically the little monopoly houses that could go in and inhabit the streets and blocks that were discussed.
And the dotted line that we see there, how much land is there?
Does anybody in the room know the answer to that question?
It's sizable, I don't remember the acreage.
20 acres, 30 acres?
Way more.
I think it's more than
100.
100 acres?
Pretty big.
I don't know, it's from, the whole section of Route 28 from.
About 50, yeah.
Yeah, Worcester Court, CVS on the north to, the Falmouth Plaza on the south, so it's sizable.
Give you a sense of scale, remember we talked about those
We can
single
find out
families?
for you.
I bet 4 of these blips is an acre. So that's probably the size of an acre. So how many of those could you tile in there? It's probably
So let's say it's 100 acres.
Yeah, yeah.
How many residential units would you envision being there?
Well, it depends.
You're talking 15 to an acre, 20 to an acre possibly?
I think if you looked at all the types we talked about, my sense is that the ones at the upper end of the spectrum we would expect the least amount of. Much like at the lower end of the spectrum, we would expect the least amount. So when we're talking about, and I'm just riffing here, by the way, but if we've got these 6 options, I'm thinking that it's somewhere in the middle here is the density that's probably the prevailing or average density, and that probably is somewhere around 10 to 15 at most. So let's call it 10 units to the acre, over 100 acres. So that's 1,000 units.
1,000 units?
If you redid the whole thing from edge to edge with.
But let's wait.
No, but we need parking.
But you have streets that are taking up some of that acreage,
Cut it in
parking
half.
that's taking, so I would say you're probably half that.
Yeah.
I just want to have a sense of your vision, and I want everyone else to understand the amount of density that you're talking about here, because you showed us these nice 1 acre parcels with density, but what you didn't show is what the neighbors thought of it, that were there before the density was added to it, because every time we try to add density in this community, I don't care where it is, the neighbors, the people who live next door, do not like it and fight it as much as possible. And I know this is going to have zoning changes, et cetera, but I want not only myself, but I want other people to have an understanding that we could be talking about 800 units, 1,000 units, plus commercial. So.
But to your point too, I think that would be a 40-year process. That wouldn't be an overnight process, but.
I certainly
But
understand that.
we totally agree with you. I mean, honestly, that's the reason we were asked to come, right, was to start talking about the issue of density, to try to take the edge off of it, try to prove density as a word. It's not a 4-letter word, right? I mean, it comes in these different forms. It can be many different things. So the hope is that through this process, I mean, that's part of the reason we want the community here, so that hopefully people can begin to understand it. Everything we do is going to be made available online. As we talk about, this is the first of several steps. I don't think at the end of it, we're going to have convinced the populace of Falmouth that higher density is easy to stomach. It is an uphill climb for sure.
Because what we're showing is almost like another small town.
That's my thing, there's one little area at a time. And each area, there's gonna be a fight for, not in my backyard.
I just want to have the vision, that's all I'm asking.
Well, and I think I'm imagining, because it's going to happen over 40 years, it's not as if there's a single vision. It's almost as if there's an idea, there's maybe a framework in place, but it's going to happen incrementally. It's not going to be sort of, we decided it's 600 units. It really will be an ongoing, ever-evolving sort of thing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And same thing would,
No, Pam needs to leave. Okay.
the same thing would happen if it was out of Hatchville. If you had 70 acres, you were going to develop it, you want to put a bunch of houses on it.
Thank you.
Same thing. What we're looking to do is not have to develop further out. We want density closer in. I haven't traveled a whole lot in Europe, but I've been to a couple countries in Europe, and I'm amazed at how much countryside there are in such small countries.
Yeah.
It's because they've embraced the village system for centuries, and so the country is still the country, and the cities and towns and villages are still there. And it's because they've embraced that.
Yes, ma'am.
It's interesting about Europe, they do green belting, and that's aristocracy has some very bad parts, but one of the good parts is it protects its land. I think this is a big public education project, really. It's surprising the number of people who don't realize the number of 40B projects already in town and that they like them. There are some very, very good ones. We have a lot of high density that was pointed out to me that I didn't realize right here downtown. And it's more having an opportunity for people to realize that a lot of it's already here, and that what we're trying to do is have some more of it right downtown. So it calls for lots of public hearings, just so that when you say density, they're not picturing a huge development plopped down beside them. It's going to take a lot of public hearings.
So to John's question, 79.6 acres,
Thank you.
plus or minus.
I don't know if there's another question.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Please.
Thank you. We see a lot of different structural types. Do you also reach a point where you consider alternative transportation systems for the community? And somebody mentioned bicycles, buses, and so on. Or
So I think we all
making
know that over
exceptions for
time
parking.
and over the next 40 years, that the transportation system network and approach to travel on vehicles likely to change. And so thinking through what changes might lie in the future as you plan for a form in a particular neighborhood is an appropriate strategy.
And also, it's very difficult to do transportation, public transportation without density. Running a bus line 5 miles down this road to pick up 10 people is not very efficient for transportation. So density makes for better transportation.
you made the argument for considering form-based design. Do you also think in terms of function-based design?
Function-based design. Elaborate, what do you mean by function-based?
For example, Jim Fox was mentioning 200 students in a particular location, and that if you build for that, you're going to have a very different form, I think, than the kinds of forms we consider today. If you build for bicycle transportation, bus transportation, you're going to have a very different form that is desirable than these kinds of dwellings.
Right.
And the question then emerges, which do you consider first? Do you lock in the appearance, or do you lock in the function? Or can you consider all of that together? There may be additional dimensions.
I think with form-based, with real form-based regulation, considerations for all of those things should be part of that form-based regulation. I do, and it's a great point. And I think when you do real form-based regulation, you're taking all of that into account, saying, I think this community needs to take into account bike access and parking and bus transportation places for all of that to happen, and you build that into your form-based code over the long term, thinking towards the future. I think from when you're talking about, let's say, dedicated seasonal housing, for example, I think, in my opinion, I don't think that really changes the forms of these things. Just as we said, some of these buildings, that building on the lower right could have 12 units in it, could have 4 units in it, could also have 20 units in it if they were small micro units. And so I think the forms of the architecture don't necessarily change with the program that you ultimately want to accommodate. I think the form of your community, you want to think about what you want that to be, and there's lots of different things that can fit into that form. I do think the transportation question is a separate one. I do think there are aspects of transportation now and certainly going into the future that are affect the way we plan urban plan. And that certainly needs to be part of the form-based code over the long term. And by the way, these things will evolve. The form-based code will evolve as changes to transportation happen.
Sorry, really, I should have made you step up. If you say anything more, please go to the mic.
Okay, sorry.
Because everybody at home sees it,
I forgot.
and that is just for those people. Everyone at home missed it. Thank you, John, for reminding me of that.
Pardon me. Thank you.
So we're closing in on an hour and a half, and I don't necessarily want to shut down communication. I'm not sure if there are any more questions.
I think we open up to anybody that hasn't said anything yet. If they
Just want to make a comment that I think one thing that occurs to me is that a lot of these would probably be empty parts of the year, where that's not a consideration in many other parts of the country or the state. we have so many second homes and people who are only here to work seasonally. But if you build something for someone for 8 weeks, 10, 12 weeks of the year, do those become just empty places waiting for the next high season to come again, or shoulder season? I mean, how does that impact the true density of our town in February or in January, say? It will look like a very different place, even with that much real estate. Will there really be that many people a year round?
Then we go from 30,000 to 100,000 now. I mean, that's basically how we fluctuate. So we've got to be prepared for it.
The ideal is that you build units that are of a size that are affordable to those that are working and living in the region, and that you start to create a more sustainable year-round neighborhood in that location. Certainly that issue of the seasonality is something we're going to have to continue to carefully factor in planning for the year-round economy and the year-round housing market. Sam?
Yeah, I think, I know we're talking about form in terms of architecture and buildings, but I think we have to think about our infrastructure as well. You can't start off on a plan like this without thinking about communication and electric. If we want to get rid of the telephone poles, the electric poles and what have you, we've got to start on that at the very beginning. We can't just simply let it go out incrementally, or it's not going to happen. We'll always be bottlenecked by not having put enough capacity in as we start. So I think we have to keep that. I mean, I think electric cars are a given. And so being able to put charging stations in, and then maybe you have excuse me, the Jiffy car concept where people are time sharing an automobile, among 20 people. Those things are going to be happening. I think we see it already starting out, but I think we have to think, if we're thinking about form-based design, we have to be thinking about those kinds of amenities as we move forward on a project like this.
So this is why I love Falmouth, right? These are the conversations that you have, and you all are so forward-thinking in terms of land planning and visioning for the future. And I'm glad to have been here for this discussion. It is just the beginning to get a context. So what I want to do is make sure that I'm not missing anybody else. On the handout that you have, there's a website on there, and so we'll post all the materials over the course of the summer. We may want to reach out to you and do a little bit of a survey work, including a housing preference study to sort of widen our audience beyond those who are in the room, and get some more feedback from the Falmouth community and the greater Cape Cod community. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come and have the conversation with you, and look forward to coming back next fall.
Can we have this to post on our website?
Sure.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Move to adjourn? You're adjourned. Thank you very much.